it was a gun.
I'm not voting.
If we want to build our nation.
The problem with the Somalians.
Just want to experience something else than a black man.
Move on, move
Be like
forward.
a horse with blinkers on.
Honestly say, I was about to have
Corrupt
sex and then I pulled
crap,
up.
but it's nice.
I'm Paul Johnson, screenwriter. Hope to be so for a while longer yet.
I'm Stephen Watson. I'm a writer and an academic.
My name's Mike Nichol. I'm a journalist and a writer. Fire played an important part in this city right from the beginning. It was the first expression of protest when the slaves rose up and tried to burn down the early settlement. It was not even a town. And fire has occurred again and again and again through Cape Town's history. And it still occurs almost annually in the mountains in terms of the fires. And then we had a spate of fires of a different type, bombs that went off during the late 1990s when Pagad was coming into its own and trying to claim the city for different reasons. And so to me, one of the sort of essential metaphors of Cape Town has always been fire. There are others. Wind is another one, it seems to me. But fire is the one that people brought to this city and have used in this city. And it's why shutters are all on the insides of houses in the Boerkaap and not on the outside of houses in the Boerkaap, because it was said that you couldn't have shutters on the outside because then a fire would run through the houses. So it affected the architecture as well. It took away the reed roofs and replaced them with flat roofs. So Cape Town has been shaped psychologically and physically.
One of the things that always supervenes or comes to mind when I think of this city and the life is, it's not so much specific population groups or this area as opposed to that area. It's funny enough, the word melancholy. Mike will know what I'm talking about because I once wrote an essay which was largely about Cape Town called A Version of Melancholy.
Of what?
Melancholy. And it seemed to me that so many elements in South African life, but in Cape Townian life, aided and abetted that sense of melancholy. I mean, the southeast, of course, which is, as I've called it once, one of the great depressive winds in the world. But the lack of texture to so much of the life, the poverty of the architecture, the vacancy in the sky, the Cape Flats sand, all these things, and there are plenty of other things I could mention. Rugby, you could even mention as a factor in this. I mean, rugby is what we have instead of culture in this country, in some very good sense. All this meant that, whereas Cape Town was the oldest city in South Africa, obviously, historically and otherwise, and most well established in those terms, and so on and so forth, it was still this relatively vacant, empty space. And perhaps even the violence of the place was part of that emptiness, if you like. And I don't know, just to ask either of you here, whether you have had at any time yourselves a similar sense of this place.
We have this infuriating complexity about Cape Town that we all kind of struggle to get a handle on. I think part of getting a handle on it is equal combination joy and frustration. And I think the thing that probably has bothered me the most about Cape Town, particularly having spent 6 years in Johannesburg, is the sense in which people really haven't kind of comprehended a lot of the reality of South Africa as it is, that essentially this country is functionally interlinked, and that we can't afford to sustain ourselves as a kind of perpetual island of uninvolvement.
Cape Townians seem to me to be highly anxious people, or as anxious as any other segment of the South African population.
The reality of the demographics hits you in the face immediately. That this is a fundamentally black country, and Joburgers have far more successfully reconcile themselves to that. I mean, there may very well be the same.
But there's an issue there.
Yeah.
And Johannesburg's a bit false in that sense, in that that reconciliation has happened in the northern suburbs. I'm not sure that it has happened outside that. So you go to the Zone or you go to Sandton and it looks like this great, happy, multi-coloured country.
Yeah.
But it actually isn't. Once you go to Rosettenville or Kenilworth or Soweto, then everything falls back into the way it was in apartheid days.
Yeah.
Now here it's different. And we haven't got any of that mixing happening anywhere. And that's why I think we look at Cape Town and say it is, as Stephen says, more anxious.
The notion that, you know, because South Africa is predominantly a black country, that all cities should somehow conform to the model of, let's just say, Johannesburg, seems to me totally erroneous. And you know, the fact that this is, you know, predominantly a Creole or coloured city, and that therefore its culture, etc., is somewhat different. That seems to me a good thing, and not necessarily something to be to shake one's head over and say, you know, Cape Town's little Europe, or etc., and it's got to get with it, and that the realities which the city is not really confronting. I mean, there are obviously pockets of predominantly, presumably white privilege, which are extraordinarily insular in their mindset, but you know, if you take Greater Cape Town, you've got the whole of this country in not only microcosm but macrocosm as well.
Yeah.
I mean, there are immigrant communities there, you know, there, etc.
It kind of prompts a consideration, at least, whether we become preoccupied with Cape Town's foibles simply because of the shape in which it expresses itself, kind of the symmetry of it, but is there perhaps not, I mean, given the recent xenophobia thing, just a general kind of South African tendency to kind of almost instinctively otherize people, scapegoat people?
I think Cape Town has always taken in people. I mean, it has done right from the first people that were brought here as slaves. It took them in, and it had to, you know, they had to become a city. It had to become a city for them. And the immigrant communities have come in all the time. It takes time, though, for Cape Town to adapt to those immigrant communities. But once that happens, and once the immigrant community, I think, decides we're here to stay, then Cape Town kind of sits back and accepts it. But that period can take anything from 15 to 20 years. And we've seen it again and again and again through the city's history.
And the conditions of life of so many Cape Townians are, you know, bigger description. And it seems to me, you know, as sure as eggs is eggs, as sure as a match produces fire, that people are going to want to start killing each other at a certain point when you put them into the kind of places that they are forced to willy-nilly live, and they have literally, you know, not a crumb of bread to eat.
I had ancestors who would indulge in waylaying people, which meant that literally you sat up in the hills, and when a group of people walked by, you shot the shit out of them. You know, that was only 5 generations ago. I could do that now.
You probably could. Who would you shoot?
No, I mean, I had a generic South African white boy's childhood, which, you know, was much more about the playing fields than perhaps anything else. I mean, I so happened to go to the kind of school which did give a marginal more emphasis to things intellectual than otherwise. But really, you know, to a large degree, I grew up, with the focus of my existence being the next rugby match or the next sporting endeavour.
We kind of project all our kind of historically received issues onto something like rugby because it's as iconic as it is in South Africa, and it doesn't do much for me, to be quite honest. And I also go with Stephen's point that we do have an issue in terms of just the bald-faced fact that while we have fairly vibrant sports economies in South Africa, we have no real creative economies around literature, around, I mean, I would say even around film. It's a hell of a challenge.
There was a time when you couldn't talk about Cape Town by name. You couldn't name streets, you couldn't name suburbs, you couldn't even name the city. And a publication came out looking at a whole range of aspects about the city, and Stephen was asked to write a little essay on the cultural side of things, the poets, the writers, etc. I had recently published a book in which I said I lived on a wind-blown peninsula in the South Pacific. Sorry, the South Atlantic. If it was in the South Pacific, that was wishful thinking. And Stephen rightfully criticised me and said, you see, he can't even mention Cape Town. And I thought about that for a long time, and it became a really significant issue, and it was something that changed the entire way that I looked at the city. And at the same time, we were moving towards 94, and the whole political landscape was changing, and suddenly we were able to use South African names in our writing because they started to take on the poetry that they had lacked before. And so for that reason, I think I owe Stephen a huge debt for having pointed this out to begin with. And then Cape Town started coming to life for me. It started coming to life in the kinds of names we had, the kinds of suburban names we had, and not only the geographical history, but the history, the people who had lived here. But it took that time to what Stephen was talking about, was to start imagining the city, which then led to the anthology that you were to do, 15 years later almost.
Yeah, the lead time was a long time, you might say. Yeah, I grew up in the city probably with a similar sort of awareness that Mike had. That it was a place, but it wasn't, quite a real place. Or if there was a real place, it was another place. New York, London, Paris, all the great metropolitan centres. And I remember, as from quite an early age, as a kid, looking around to find some sort of image, reflection, representation of the city. Because I wanted, I had from an early age what you might call the Adamic curse, which is I wanted to name, I wanted to see the place I lived in named and given some sort of significant life, an echo, some resonance in something other than just the street I was tramping on or the building I was walking into or out of. And I realized quite rapidly that in fact those resonances, artistic representations and so on and so forth, didn't really exist. Or if they existed, those representations had no significant life in the life of the culture that I was part of. And this perturbed me. It perturbed me for a very obvious reason. It perturbed me because it was demonstrably true that Cape Town was this remarkable environment. It was geologically remarkable. It was culturally remarkable, and so on and so forth. It had, quite apart from all the things that make it the premier tourist attraction it now is. And yes, so it did mean that at odd points, way back when, I would comment, sometimes rather critically, on the fact that, for example, yes, you just said you live sort of somewhere on a peninsula, somewhere in the South Atlantic.
Or Pacific, depending on where you thought.
As if that wasn't, the place that you really lived wasn't real enough to actually be mentioned by name, which in a certain sense for a lot of Cape Townians was true. And that's, as Mike said, that's why I put together an anthology of writings by local and expatriate Cape Townian writers about what it meant to inhabit the city. And of course it meant it so happened there were about 19 writers included in this particular collection called A City Imagined, and they had their various takes on the place. But it was a very, very fascinating thing just to see how people conceived of this place that they lived in. I call the book A City Imagined because, of course, the place one lives in is never just a place. It is always a meeting of a place and a mind, a place and a sensibility, and so on and so forth. Do you know the Brecht poem?
No.
I sit by the roadside, the driver changes the wheel. I do not like the place I've come from. I do not like the place I'm going to. Why with impatience do I watch him changing the wheel? One always dreams, and even I suppose the dreamless dream, but I would like to have the sense that I used to have, say 1997, 98, that there were people around, whether at governmental level or any other level, who were conducing towards, within reason, making South Africa a slightly better place for more people. That's a bleak and perhaps or slightly conventional dream. But, you know, I really did once have that sense, and I don't have that sense any longer.
That we can achieve some kind of stability and coalescence and some sense of that and some kind of civility in our ability to live with each other.